Hello, I'm Hugh Davies from La Trobe University. I'm going to be discussing my paper, The Paranoid Interface. Rather than going through the whole paper today, I'm really just sort of going to try and keep it quite quick and pithy and really get to the key points of the paper, hopefully. I'm using a bit of an untested technology in this recording lab here, so you have to bear with me. I'm sort of not quite sure what I'm doing, but hopefully we'll be okay. So, so far so good. So the paranoid interface, which is what I'm discussing today. So rather than considering alternate, augmented or mixed reality experiences from the point of view of devices, the devices on which they're delivered, or the experiences themselves as content, this paper approaches the field from kind of the opposite direction, instead considering notions of reality itself, and specifically how notions of reality have evolved and changed. Specifically, this paper explores the rise of what I call paranoid perception. So I argue that in recent years a distinctly paranoid and conspiratorial understanding of reality has emerged that brings with it opportunities and implications for mixed, alternate and augmented reality experiences, particularly in the realm of games. So in discussing paranoia, I'm not referring to clinical paranoia from a medical or a psychoanalytic perspective. Those are not my qualifications and not my interest, my drive. Rather, I'm discussing the widely observed cultural tendency towards conspiracy thinking that has influenced mainstream understandings of reality. So to be clear, this paper does not aim to explain the reasons behind the presence of paranoid perception or to assess the truth values of its theories. Instead, I aim to recognise and highlight the pervasiveness of paranoid perception and to explore how it is being applied in mixed, alternate and hybrid reality games. So, this is kind of the structure of my paper, I guess. This is essentially what I will be discussing. These findings come from, personally from 2011 when I developed my own alternate reality game, The Darkest Puzzle, which recontextualised a whole lot of conspiracy theories about the 9/11 attacks and how that was disseminated through conspiracy theories over the following decade, and specifically what the ethics of creating serious games about real-world tragedies could be. But what emerged from the process of creating and delivering that game was for me a much more significant understanding of how reality is popularly understood within present societal conditions. What became apparent was that paranoia has become a legitimate tool of reasoning to explain a multitude of global incidents and really has become a pervasive way of understanding reality. So this inclination towards paranoid thinking is what I term paranoid perception. So I guess the main thing I want to sort of say is really kind of to discuss the impact of paranoid deception, which I believe signals a radical shift in subjective positioning. So it really kind of overturns the last 500 years of linear perspective, which is to say the kind of scopic system, the way in which we perceive reality as an individual looking out on the world. Instead, the paranoid perception is not simply of the kind of camera eye view of an individual looking out on the world, but also of the world looking back, and also of the notion of there being connections between things that are not made explicit, that there are hidden connections. So I guess to kind of discuss what I mean, I'm going to refer to some historical painting. So beginning with Bruegel the Elder from 1559-1560 and his view of painting, which he really kind of eschewed the Renaissance idea of perspective and went back to a kind of pre-perspective, pre-Renaissance idea of symbolic painting, whereby you have a scene here. People are probably familiar with this painting, The Fight Between Carnival and Lent. But what you get in this painting is almost like a God's eye view. You see all of the people in the painting almost as it were God would see them, which is kind of almost looking from above. And even though there is some shift in terms of people in the foreground are larger than people in the background who are smaller, nonetheless it's not adhering to the strict notions of linear perspective. I think I can draw on this thing. So it doesn't, maybe not, it doesn't have this diminishing perspective view, and it's kind of this godlike view that you see in a lot of particularly Christian painting from the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the I suppose the importance of the second commandment, which is to not represent in linear ways, but to paint in a more symbolic way. And then to contrast those ideas with this work, the Ideal City, which by Giorgio Mantini, who's, even though painting in 1490, really at the beginning of the Renaissance, really embraced this idea of perspective and this idea of the single point of view, which of course had been developed by the ancient Greeks but had really kind of died or not been used for some time, because of course it precedents the individual eye over the eye of God, as we saw in the previous painting. So this notion of the linear perspective which is really reigned from the Renaissance, is predicated on a measured single vantage point, capable of reconstructing a view through the eye, similar to the apparatus of the camera. Paranoid view is different. It's fragmentary, and it's reconstructed from multiple viewpoints, and it looks both ways. It looks inwards and outwards. It's kind of a reverse panopticon, and in many ways it resembles the internet, which is to say the internet is watching you just as you are watching it, and it has links between things. There are kind of associations, some of which are explicit and some of which are implicit. And I present this work here from Salvador Dali, his Paranoid Visage, Visage Paranoïque from 1935, and with this work and with works around Salvador Dali's paranoid critical method, he was really exploring the idea of paranoia as a creative aesthetic, that it could create associations, that there wasn't a single view of reality, but perhaps multiple views. And of course here we see two things at once. We see a face of a woman lying on her side, but we also see a group of people standing around what looks to be an African hut. So this idea of being able to see two different things simultaneously. So I'm not the first to observe the rise of paranoid perception, but what I aim to do here is to really kind of establish its credentials. What I mean by that is that paranoid perception has something of, it's been well recognised. It's in his seminal essay on the paranoid style in American politics. Richard Hofstadter discusses it, but he condemns it as heated exaggeration and conspiratorial fantasy. Likewise, Daniel Pipes has observed in his 1997 diagnosis of paranoia that it tends to be it tends to be a poisoned discourse that encourages a vortex of illusion and superstition. But nonetheless, it's very popular. A lot of people have this kind of paranoid view. They carry conspiracy theories about the world. Purportedly 80% of US citizens believe that the government knows more about extraterrestrials than it admits, for example. And the majority of US citizens believe that there is an official cover-up between events such as the JFK assassination and the 9/11 attacks. So this conspiratorial thinking provides this kind of logic of better understanding reality than I suppose the official voices do. However, within academia, there is, and within, I suppose, the whole discourse of scientific reasoning, there is this rejection of paranoid thinking, which I understand and to a certain extent I adhere to, but nonetheless I think that there's a moral flavour to these arguments that disrupt empirical study. And I'm quoting here from Steph Orpers, who reminds us that it's not really the role of the academic to determine what is rational and what is not, but rather, and not to say what is sane and insane, good and bad, but rather to just observe these notions of reality and what effects they have. And certainly we can't, we have to but recognise this paranoid thinking and to realise its pervasiveness without necessarily subscribing to it. I draw here on the Žižekian notion of Christmas, which is to say it's irrelevant whether we believe in it or not. We nonetheless go through the ritual of it, and a sizable part of the global economy revolves around Christmas, in spite of whether people believe in it or not. Likewise, I would argue the same is true of paranoid thinking. It doesn't really matter whether we believe in it or not. It's enough of a phenomenon to inform the way in which reality is perceived today. So, what I'd like to do now is to discuss how this paranoid thinking is being played out in games, how it occurs in games, and what the opportunities, I suppose, for it could be. So, I might even just get rid of this and go to, if I can work out how to. Bear with me for a moment. So I'm just going to bring up a couple of games here in the hybrid reality, alternate reality space. So augmented and alternate reality games are renowned for intentionally dissolving the boundaries between real and fictional worlds, so really playing into this logic of paranoid perception. This interweaving of reality and fantasy across virtual and physical worlds is kind of the central appeal of these games. When employed as part of the game design, this technique can bring about intense player involvement in a game's complex illusions of reality. And the paranoid hermeneutics of these games are really kind of integral to their enigmatic quality. Such that game designers will deliberately try and blur the lines between reality and fiction in order to provoke players' sense of uncertainty and to deepen their immersion. Game designer Marcus Montola remarks that, as a result, players become paranoid, suspecting that everything relates to the game. Likewise, digital humanities scholar Steve E. Jones has observed that mixed reality games nurture a more or less playful paranoia in which participants are enticed into hermeneutic interactions with the narrative fragments they uncover. According to game designer and scholar Jane McGonigal, alternate reality games are themselves benevolent conspiracies that exhibit paranoia's opposite disposition, pronia, or the suspicion that the universe is a conspiracy on your behalf. Researcher Chad Volrath suggests that alternate reality games have the capacity to arouse uncanny similarities between in-game web conspiracies and real-world networks of collaboration integral to the game's production, thereby creating a turbulence between the two realms, the game production and the game itself. So by looking behind the curtain of the condition of a game's production, players find themselves confronted with a web of actual corporate relations that mirror the fictional map of corporate conspirators. So in this fashion, they kind of blur the boundary between real and fictional worlds at an even deeper level. So I claim that hybrid reality experiences, such as those offered by alternate and mixed reality games, offer a kind of paranoid interface, which is to say a means of perceiving the world that closely corresponds to the logic of paranoid perception. Through augmented reality, for example, users are shown hidden layers of information accessible only through the interface, but they simultaneously understand that this concealed content is not reality at all, but a technologically falsified simulacra, a chain of technologically falsified realities, which paradoxically corresponds with a paranoid perception of the world. And I argue this is some of the appeal of these games and experiences, is that they correspond to a paranoid perception of the world. Likewise, alternate reality games present an alternate view of the world, an alternate view that corresponds very closely to and actually overlaps with actual reality, but containing subtle but crucial differences. So, an increasing number of hybrid reality experiences draw on and play with paranoid perception in their content. Alternate reality games have traded in conspiracy theory and paranoia from the outset. Examples include Majestic, which was a game from the late 2000s, early 2000s, 2001, which was constructed around existing conspiracy theories. Likewise, the Lost experience, which accompanied the Lost television show in 2006, very much a conspiracy theory alternate reality game. 9 Inch Nails' Year Zero, whose plot involved a hyper-conservative religious cult taking over the US government, and my own game, The Darkest Puzzle, from 2011, that recontextualised the conspiracy theories surrounding 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, as a game. More recently, augmented reality games have begun to take on an increasingly paranoid flavour and a move towards the conspiratorial. For example, Google's Ingress, one of the perhaps biggest augmented reality games, is a massive multiplayer augmented reality game set in the future, but playable in the physical world of the present. Its complex and paranoid sci-fi backstory, combined with the recognition that by opting in, your personal data is being heavily tracked by Google for unspecified purposes. But this paranoia and intrigue has kind of only served to drive the game's popularity. Additionally, the augmented reality book Art for Spooks, created by Nicholas Knopf and Claudia Peterson, draws on secretive information, including data from the Edward Snowden leaks and leaks to actual NSA documents. Inspired by avant-garde surrealists' paranoid critical method, such as the Salvador Dali work I showed earlier, these artists seek to forge new links between the book's content and potentially unrelated material. Also in book form is modern Palaxis. Written, illustrated and animated by Australian comic artist Sutu. The book combines paper-based publishing and augmented reality interfaces into a paranoid narrative. The story concerns a time traveller who believes that the world world we live in is a holographic projection. I'll wrap things up. So, with this paper, what I've tried to do is to introduce the concept of paranoid perception and to provide some scholarly evidence for it. As I say, I've tried to condense things a little bit for this presentation, but if you look into the paper itself, you will find all of those academic references and so on. This phenomenon, I argue, it represents a major shift in how reality is understood, and therefore holds significant opportunities for mixed and alternate reality games. Thank you.